Hey everybody, it's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano on the road, like always these days, it seems. You can see behind me, I'm at the Frost Investments headquarters in San Diego. Those folks working on investing in alternative proteins and doing great work for the sector. Just had a bunch of great meetings with them, and I thought, well, I'll just stay and do the Plant-Based Business Hour from Frost Investments. Shout out to them for the great work that they do. They're not the only ones doing great work today, and I'm over the moon to bring on my guests. Let me just set the tone. A lot of you know that I'm the CEO of VegTech Invest. We're focused on the public markets and investing in the public markets. We have a financial tool, an ETF in the public markets of those plant-based innovation companies anywhere up and down the supply chain that are innovating to replace inefficient animal proteins. So I was asked to speak on the keynote panel for the leading impact investing conference called ESG for Impact. I was over last year, I couldn't get anyone to talk to me about food systems transformation. The year before that, forget it. I could barely get into the conference. Now here, 2 years down the road, not only has the work paid off, but we were talking food systems transformation all over the place. There was the keynote panel that I was on. There was a biodiversity panel, obviously food system transformation and biodiversity linked. We'll talk about it in today's show. And then there was another breakout session on regenerative ag and alternative proteins. I was working my way into that conversation, as well as I worked my way into the conversation that was to be had on biodiversity with today's guest that I bring on without further ado. I want to bring on the founder of Mighty Earth, Glenn Hurowitz. I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yes. Well done.
Glenn, I am over the moon to talk about Mighty Earth and all of the powerful things that you do. I did see you speak at ESG for Impact, and I was like, oh my God, this man is so dialed in. Of course, I knew that from your LinkedIn profile already. Now, just let's level set. For those who may not know, what is Wild Earth and what Mighty Earth, and the work that you do?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for that very kind introduction. Mighty Earth is a global advocacy organization working to protect nature and climate. We try to focus on the issues that don't get enough attention from the broader climate and environmental community. So first amongst those for us is nature, because it is the destruction of nature is the core of the extinction crisis, which is, if you can believe it, even more severe than the climate crisis, as bad as that is. And nature is 37% of the solution to climate change, but yet only gets 3% of the funding. So we also work on other areas like decarbonizing heavy industry that similarly don't get enough attention. But our flagship effort is transforming the meat industry. And the reason for that is that meat causes more deforestation than all the rest of agriculture combined, more climate pollution than the entire transportation sector. And we believe has the potential, if we can change the way that protein is produced, to really free up hundreds of millions of acres of land that can then, you can restore ecosystems, restore habitat for wildlife, and suck gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, not so fast, my friend.
Okay.
That was wonderful, but let's roll it back, because basically every word you've said is so critically important to understanding how our food system is currently demolishing our planet, and how our food system is the solution to a healthy planet. So let's take a step back first. Let's talk about deforestation. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, the leading cause of deforestation and therefore biodiversity loss is our food system. And that food system, as we all know, is predicated on animal protein. Let's go over, I can share or you can share, why would our food system focused on animals be the driving force of deforestation, for those who might not know?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that meat, and especially beef, but really all forms of animal protein, require so much feed or so much land to raise them. It's such an inefficient way to get calories. A meat-based diet requires about 16 times the amount of land as a plant-based diet. So we see in our work on the front lines in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, what this looks like. And what you see are gigantic plantations or ranches that you hear about industrial agriculture here in the United States. What we see on the ground in Latin America from the big meat companies is of an order of magnitude that's sort of incomprehensible, even if you've been to Iowa or Nebraska and seen, large 2,000 acre ranches. What we see there are 50,000 acres, 100,000 acres out to the horizon, cleared of all native vegetation, all the wildlife, often have indigenous people displaced from that land, largely for the purpose of creating ranch land to raise cattle or animal feed plantations like soy and corn. So to us, it's so frustrating because it's ugly. We see, you see these massive fires. I will say that stopping deforestation should be the low-hanging fruit of changing the meat industry. There are 1.6 billion acres of previously deforested land where you could expand agriculture without threatening native ecosystems. So that's like the number one thing that we're asking these companies to do is just do what's easy, channel your development onto the degraded land. I will share some good news on that front. We have seen success, and I think that all of these problems have solutions, right? And they are all economically viable. One of the things I'm proudest of that we did at Mighty Earth was really lead the charge to break the link between deforestation and agriculture in Southeast Asia for palm oil, which was the leading driver of deforestation there, and rubber, and our allies did work there, and also on pulp and paper. And we've seen through campaigns and advocacy, working with shareholders, engaging with CEOs, the major companies in that industry adopted policies that led to a 90% decline in deforestation for industrial agriculture. It wasn't so long ago that they were bulldozing Indonesia and Malaysia to create room for these giant plantations. That has mostly stopped. We're still working on some isolated examples of it. But the tragedy is, and I think this speaks to a lot of where the meat industry is right now, even on this lowest hanging fruit, they have resisted that change. You have big businesses like JBS, Cargill, and Bunge that are continuing to drive deforestation because of their desire for land in part, but also the fact that their inertia, the cultural inertia, the lack of desire to consider different ways of doing things, even where they're economically profitable, and even where there's many large scale examples of success, I think speaks to where the meat industry is right now.
Yeah, it's really frustrating because they're protected in many cases by government. Would you agree? Is that the accurate understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think the meat industry, more than other industries that we tackle, has a stranglehold over policymaking process here in Washington and frankly in many capitals around the world. I mean, even in Europe, which tends to be more progressive on these issues, you see enormous influence from the meat industry lobbying against, allowing alternative protein products to say we're a plant-based hamburger or something, something very simple like that everybody understands it's not actually meat. And I think there's still part of that reason is I think there's a myth that grips politics that the meat industry somehow represents farmers. And they, these are the ones doing the lobbying are typically the large companies that we see as really driving most of the problem. There, to be sure, there are, some ranchers, for instance, who slaughter wolves and cougars and other wildlife that they believe threatens their livestock and engage in things like lobbying against the Endangered Species Act. But the reality is that, when you look at industrial meat, it is dominated by big companies. We've done a lot of grassroots organizing in the Midwest, in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Chesapeake Bay, right in the meat industry heartland. And we've been tackling issues like water pollution. What was really fascinating to me and exciting, actually, was that we had many farmers come out of the woodwork to support our campaigns to change the meat industry. And what the reason for that, and many of them were very politically conservative, the reason for that was they felt trapped in this system that subsidizes the meat industry, subsidizes unsustainable ways of producing animal feed at this vast scale that pours pollution into the Mississippi and other waterways. And they knew that it could be done better, but the way the contracts work, the way they have long-term ties to companies like Tyson and Cargill makes it very difficult for them. And so what we found was that we actually think these issues can bring people together across the political spectrum, even where they're divided on other issues.
Yeah, and I would agree that this is possible in many ways. National security issues of, the USDA
Yeah.
just put out that in the United States, wealthiest country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, food insecurity just went up 25% 2022 over 2021, from about 10.2 million to about 12.8 million people in the United States. Unfathomable that we're not feeding our own right here.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways to bring people together across both sides of the spectrum. Food insecurity, not just a problem here in the United States, but a problem in Africa, China, India, and so those places all have a growing middle class, and they're all going to want more food, better food. If they can't get it because of the resource inefficiency that requires so much land destruction to grow so much crops for animals, you start running out of land, you start running out of water, you start running out of food, then you have political issues on your own home front. So food security becomes an issue of national security, and I think that's a Democratic and Republican connection, if you will.
No, absolutely. And, I think certainly, I don't think one can say it's the only cause of the war in Israel right now, but it is true that the food insecurity, which is fueled in great measure by the fact that the meat industry is vacuuming up, 75% of the land's capacity to produce calories. That drives up food prices. And it makes people hungry. When people are hungry, they get desperate. And, I think even more actually, if you look at the war in Ukraine, which is breadbasket for the world, a lot of that food production is actually destined for the meat industry. And so there's great analysis that if you reduce the consumption of meat by some very modest percentage, you would easily make up for the loss of exports from Ukraine and Russia due to the war there.
Yeah, so just so much to unpack here. I want to get back to eutrophication, the dirtying of water. And I do want to get back to nature being 30% of the solution and only getting 3% of the funding. So don't let me stop without getting back to those two things. But first, I just really want to hit home for people. I'm going to bring up an image because I want people to understand. So why would it take so much land to produce meat? Well, hopefully you can all see here. So it takes about 7 to 9 calories of feed to get 1 calorie of chicken. I get this from the World Resources Institute. It takes about 25 to 35 calories to get 1 calorie of cow, about 16 to get 1 calorie of pig. So what that means is you have trees that are pulling carbon from the air. But oh well. Cut down those trees, grow crops that have fiber and protein. Are you giving that food to people? No, you're giving it to animals, but they're going to need 16 times more, 25 to 35 times more of those calories. They're also going to need land, water, time. You're going to have to cut down more trees, grow more food. Still not giving that food to people, giving it to animals. We're talking about this very long cost of goods sold, which has a lot of externalized costs to society: pandemic risk, antibiotic resistance, forming, deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate change, climate change in a second. So you have this very expensive, because it takes your land, water, and causes all these problems, long cost of goods sold, and you're using up all of your resources. So the result in that respect then brings us to this other chart, which you can see. I'm sorry, everybody, pull out your glasses, focus on the little thing here. It's from Our World in Data. 77% of our agricultural land only gives us 18% of our calories. Basically, we use up 80% of our land to get 20% back. Now, as we have to feed more people as the population grows, going from 8 billion to 10 billion, but you're not getting more land. You're already using 80% of your agricultural land. But Africa wants protein, India wants meat, China wants meat. The math doesn't work. So you're going to have to find a better, you're going to have to find a better way to feed people. And this is why we're talking about alternative proteins, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Before we get to alternative proteins being the solution, tell me about nature as the solution, and I'm not surprised, only getting 3% of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, the biggest opportunity to stop emissions in the short run is stopping deforestation. So when you tear down a rainforest, typically to make room for cattle ranching or soy animal feed, that releases all the carbon that's stored in the trees and the ecosystem. It's also true for savannas and mangroves that are torn down for shrimp farms, for instance. So that's like the most acute and urgent priority. But second, the forests in particular, when they're standing, they have mature forests have the capacity to absorb enormous amounts of carbon, sequester it into the soil. There's also a great study came out recently showing that you can reach 95% of our climate goals purely by restoring wildlife to their historic populations. One of the things that motivates me to do this work is the fact that our world is totally out of balance. 96% of mammal biomass is humans, livestock, and pets, and just 4% are wild mammals. So, think about that for a moment, that we've, essentially this one species, humans, have so dominated the ecosystem that 96% of it exists to serve us, and we've just left 4% for our fellow mammals. And it's not quite as acute in birds, but it's similar in balance. And so the wildlife have these amazing impacts. Great whales, for instance, not only sequester a lot of carbon in their bodies, but they cause these trophic effects where when they go through the water column and when they poop, it actually causes a lot of carbon to be absorbed on the seafloor. Fish populations, same thing, probably the biggest engine. And then even things like restoring orangutans and forest elephants and musk oxen across the northern territories. These all have enormous potential to sequester carbon. And horse forests and other plant-based ecosystems, are the ultimate source. So we have this tremendous untapped potential. And the reason it's untapped is because we keep expanding our footprint so we can produce, I wouldn't say more food, but mostly more meat. And it's kind of a big waste. And I think this is the tragedy for me. As I said, like the meat industry itself, you could still produce meat and have a way lower footprint by stopping deforestation, stopping excessive methane pollution. But to get over the long term to the true transformation, if you can take advantage of the fact that plant-based protein is so much more efficient, then that is the thing that can really allow nature to be the full engine of solving the climate crisis and solving the extinction crisis. One thing that gave me a little hope recently was a study that came out in the New York Times saying that because of declining birth rates, actually in about 300 or 400 years, the human population could be under 200 million people. Presumably, at that point, our descendants will travel lighter on the earth. However, right now, our generation is still driving this massive extinction. And so if we don't have orangutans, and we don't have cougars, and we don't have wolves, and we don't have all these wonderful species that make up our planet, that we share it with, that are left when we finally learn how to sort of live in balance, what kind of planet will it be? And so this is like, we are in this position of peak population, peak meat consumption, peak consumption in general. Like, it is our generation that really has this challenge to address it.
Yes, and that meat consumption is only growing, again, with these large middle classes finally having the money for what is deemed to be a status item for meat. And ultimately, we as a population have to answer this question. We have to make more food that is more nutritious, using fewer resources in a shorter amount of time, creating less damage. So what can solve that mathematical equation? This is where business, so we say that there's only 3% of the funding going to nature solutions, but nature solutions really are 30% of the problem-solving capacity. This is where business jumps in. So business loves efficiency. Business despises inefficiency, which is why the meat industry has been able to survive so long with lobbyists, because they're actually lobbying against logical capitalistic targets, if you will, because they're so inefficient and they require subsidies to exist. So if you can make more food using fewer resources and then expending fewer dollars to clean up dirtying water and other problems from the meat industry, like antibiotic resistance and pandemic risk, we'll get to that in a second, you are saving money. So, are you seeing more interest in investing in natural solutions? I'm seeing it from my end. A lot of investors are interested in protecting biodiversity. Are you seeing that?
Well, on the one hand, I think no, there's certainly not sufficient. I think there is modestly growing investment in conservation and restoration. So, I mentioned earlier that there's been this great success in dramatically reducing deforestation in Southeast Asia for these different commodities. But where we have not had a breakthrough is getting the large palm oil and rubber and paper companies to actually proactively invest in restoring and healing the damage of 30,000 square miles of deforestation that they brought after the last decades. There are initiatives like LEAF, where you have big companies like Goldman Sachs, Amazon, and others investing in actual on-the-ground conservation and restoration. That's good, but the scale is still modest. And I think governments, as part of their climate strategy, are not fully realizing the potential for climate. I think part of the reason for this is that when climate change first hit the headlines, many of the people who are aware of it really were what I call energy fetishists. So they focused largely on the energy sector, and the energy sector is really important for climate change. I don't want to downplay that, but it is also clear that the single sector that has the most potential and is the most underinvested in is nature. And so this has been a long-term struggle. I think we've made some progress on it, on injecting nature into it, but there's a way to go. From a business perspective, I would say, if you look over the last 5-10 years, the surge in investment in alternative protein does give me some hope. In fact, Boston Consulting Group came out with a study in the last year or so showing that the single best climate investment, dollar for dollar, is plant-based protein. When I saw this, I felt a little enthusiastic because this chart shows like the second are cement, iron, and steel, which we also work on, but nature and plant-based protein are flagship efforts. So, from Mighty Earth's perspective, I thought we were putting our money into the right areas. But I think from an investment perspective, this is where decarbonization potential aligns with the potential to grow businesses and make profit.
Yeah, and just to underscore what you said, everybody can see on the screen. Sorry for the audio podcast, but you can see on the screen. A plant-based innovation 3 times to 40 times more impactful than investing in other green technology, primarily because a lot of the innovations already exist. So let's take fermentation tanks with a company like AB InBev, one of the largest fermenters in the world. Well, you can also ferment proteins, just like you would ferment beer. So there's the infrastructure is already mildly in place, let's say, so you don't need as much money to build out that infrastructure as you need for the other sectors. Just think about not everyone wants to turn in their car and get an electric vehicle for $60,000 when they have a car that's running. But anyone can grab a plant-based burger off the shelf, as simple as that. Maybe it's $1 or $2 more, but not that big a deal. So it's just easier to access, and that will have faster growth. Okay, let me ask you. You talked a little bit about farmers, but I sort of see this as, gosh, I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. I kind of liken it not to smoking, which often happens, but to the opioid crisis. No one benefited except one large pharmaceutical company, maybe other pharmaceutical companies. Society didn't benefit, governments didn't benefit, employers didn't benefit, like no one benefited, but they had bought out the right people. I'm not close to this subject, so if I'm using the wrong words, people, I apologize. But they had made the right strategic political alignments such that they were able to continue and get approval from the government, etc. And I sort of see it like that. We as a society, including farmers, be you to the left or to the right, do not benefit from our current food supply system. Now, please let me just say, we used to. I don't, we all grew up eating meat. Many people love it. It's what we all know. I'm not expecting it to change overnight. It served us well when we had 50% of the population on the planet. But it no longer serves us, right down to the farmer. How long do you think it will take for people to see this?
Sorry, how long do I think it takes to get to the
for the general public to come around to this. There's a very defensive mechanism of the general public. Don't take my burger.
Yeah.
That burger is causing a lot of problems for you, but really for your children.
Right. Well, so I think the reality, look, our society, our economy is historically terrible at including externalities like the environment, which is crazy that we consider an externality, in the cost of the products that we consume. So it's not a new phenomenon, and it's not exclusive to plant-based proteins or to nature or really to the environment. There's a lot of other externalities as well that are not normally included. This is where government should come in, and this is where consumer power and campaigns can also come in. So at some level, what we try to do is bring that externality cost, or at least the prospect of that externality cost, in. And we do that through campaigns, through legal cases, through working with investors. So for instance, JBS, world's largest meat company, they on their own produce more methane than France, Germany, UK, and Belgium combined from the meat production. And they have not done enough to invest in alternative proteins. They have some investments, which I strongly support. They're building a big cultured protein facility in Spain. But this is still, less than 1% of their operations. They're still driving massive deforestation. So what we've done, they're trying to go public on the New York Stock Exchange. We call this the IPO that's probably the single biggest risk for the climate in history. We've filed papers with the SEC to ask them to stop the IPO until JBS reports more honestly on its climate impact and takes action to address it. And we think that because of JBS's long record of corruption and fraudulent reporting of its climate performance, that they won't be able, they shouldn't be able to get SEC approval. If we can stop this, I hope that causes JBS to look and say, our performance on the environment is costing us the opportunity to list on U.S. capital markets. That's costing us probably tens of billions of dollars. And so I think even without passing a huge bill in Congress that would be a big political football, which we should try to do also, you can bring that externality cost in through very strategic campaigning. And that's what Mighty Earth is all about. Second, I do think that from a big picture economic perspective, when it comes to alternative protein, we have to get this alternative protein industry to the scale where it can compete on price and texture and flavor with industrial meat. There are some excellent products that I think do that in their particular niche right now, but it's not the norm. And so for that reason, what we're trying to do is we're trying to persuade big supermarkets like Ahold Delhaize, which owns Stop and Shop, and Food Lion and Giant here in the United States, and others to say by 2030 we're going to sell 10% plant-based protein. We think if we can get there, and this is what I hear from the industry, is you can get to the kind of scale that will allow that competition on taste. So to me, that's the vision. Then they can grow from there. So I do think that you need a push to do that. You need both government incentives and you need political lobbying and organizing to achieve that. And then you also need these companies to face pressure from their consumers to actually do something about this problem. Like certainly stop deforestation, stop belching so much methane into the atmosphere, but also start to invest in a real way, not just a greenwashing way, not just a way to sort of, reach a niche population, but something that will truly build scale in this industry.
Mm-hmm. Just to kind of follow up a little bit behind you. So according to the United Nations Environmental Program, a whopping 32% of the world's global methane emissions comes from animal fat, primarily cows. But comes from animals. Please.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that is more than fossil fuels. Like we fossil fuel. We should get away from fossil fuels totally, and we work on that too. But the biggest thing that we can do on methane is actually shift to alternative proteins.
Yes, right. Of course. So we have this with the work that we do at VegTech Invest, because we aren't investing in the companies that are producing all of the methane. We, through emissions avoidance, have products in the marketplace that are carbon neutral without buying offsets. All of our research and all of the research of our third-party certifiers say that we're the only ETF that is carbon neutral without buying offsets. So you see how powerful it can be just through emissions avoidance. to put forth a different food supply system, alternative protein, that aren't creating this kind of damage. Because ultimately, we have to make more food that is more nutritious using fewer resources in a shorter amount of time while creating less damage. So, picking up on what you're saying, just quick shout out to FAIR, Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return. They also do a lot of the work that you're talking about, trying to bring on investors and private companies, be they privately held or publicly traded, just like we do at VegTech Invest. All three of us are kind of working on shifting to get to that point, more investment that will get us to build the infrastructure that will get us to 10% of the need for protein consumption to be alternative protein. That comes from bringing down the price. That comes from having more capital inflowing into the system. How do you see that happening?
Well, I mean, one of our goals is to get investors to do more. Now, I think right now is a, let's say, mixed investment climate for alternative protein companies.
That market's out there.
But when I talk to leaders of those companies, I think it's incredibly frustrating because the ingredients are there for growth. I think, especially, if you look internationally, you see growing demand. And so investors are slow to do it. I find it paradoxical given the climate potential and the increasing premium put on delivering climate solutions from policymakers. There's always understandable caution about a relatively new sector. But for us, this is one of the reasons that we see it so important for mainstream companies that sell a lot of meat, Tesco, Walmart, others, to invest and set goals for selling alternative proteins. We've seen some companies like Lidl and Aldi already set some initial targets and also commit to price parity on their shelves so that they're selling alternative protein for the same cost as regular meat, so that they can hit goals for like 40%, 50% alternative protein by 2030. So there's some supermarket chains, especially those based in Europe, that are already doing that. I hope that if we can get more retailers, fast food companies to send the signal that they are setting goals, that they're going to invest in alternative protein, that will create it will send a signal to investors that this is a growing sector. I think that it seems inevitable to me that this is going to grow, both because of the pressure on food prices and the fact that you more and more can have plant-based alternative proteins that deliver that kind of texture and experience that people expect from meat. I was just in London with our UK team. We had dinner at this restaurant called Studio Gautier, which is entirely plant-based. They served beef bourguignon, and it was sinewy. You could see the flesh as it was tearing apart. I mean, I think for people who've maybe been vegan all their life, not appealing, but even though I ate meat 20 years ago, I liked it. And so I loved this flavor. I passed it around. We ate so much, but we ordered a second one. It was actually, I asked the chef, and it was made by an Israeli company called Redefined Meat. And it was just remarkable to me that you could have such a realistic product from plant-based meat. It was actually 3D printed. So it was a fascinating technological innovation. And when you look at some of the existing products on hamburgers or sausages or hot dogs or even chicken, the experience exists. It's going to become more widespread. These companies need capital to scale, but they're going to get there. I do think that when I can't imagine any industry that's going to grow more than this one, frankly.
I want that to be heard loud and clear to all the investors out there. You can't imagine a sector that's going to grow any more than this one. And I would add to that, in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah.
I think when the change happens, it's going to be like falling dominoes, and it's going to happen really quickly. I would like to know, I asked you, how are we going to get there? I think I'm going to ask you the reverse question is, what's keeping us from getting there? I'll give my own 2 cents in a second. In addition to having this pressure put on climate solutions,
yeah.
you have the state of California, which has now demanded that companies privately held or publicly traded $1 billion or more have to disclose scopes 1, 2, and 3. This is where the emissions are in scope 3. Animal factories being quite clearly in scope 3. So I don't even know how JBS would fare on the public markets were they to provide honest information. Because the SEC is going to quickly come around to, we hope, demanding scopes 1, 2, and 3. Maybe not 3 right away, but we're really hoping for scopes country. Anyway, California, the fifth largest economy in the world, has already done that. So with this pressure and more transparency in how businesses do business, so the consumer now much more aware that JBS dumps into the Illinois River or these kinds of things, which it did about 5 years ago, and there's a lawsuit where I believe it lost. These kinds of damaging to our public society, the consumer knows more and more about this. So there's all this pressure. I kind of would, a bad market aside, so tricky economic times aside, inflation aside, I kind of thought we would have been further along. So not just what's going to get us there, but what is it that's holding us back? Is it as simple as still not at scale, or do you think it's government protection?
So there's certainly government protection. I mean, we should be aware of the fact that alternative protein companies are competing on a very stilted playing field, right? Like the meat industry has benefited from generations of subsidies. Those are ongoing. The fines that companies like Cargill and JBS pay when they pour pollution into the water and when they have, they're either zero or very limited and do not reflect the cost of the meat industry on the land, on the water. And so, it's not a level playing field. Having said that, I don't think that means it's doomed, because you look at what happened in the clean energy sector. The fossil fuel industry also benefited from generations of tax breaks and subsidies. And yet, with concrete investment from smart people, it's like this clean energy, solar, wind, geothermal, is a more efficient and cleaner way to produce energy. And now, for the most part, it's cheaper than fossil fuels. Right. So, all proteins are probably 20 years behind renewable energy, but we're on a path. We're starting, and I think we can get there. In terms of what's holding it back, I think there's a lack of imagination about that. I think the energy fetish that I described earlier is holding it back. I talk to a lot of big investors. They say, we're one of the earliest funds to tackle decarbonization. We started in 2020. And, and so we're investing in clean energy and decarbonization, and that's great. Like, we strongly encourage that. But I do think a lot of investors are missing the massive opportunity in nature in general, food systems in particular, and most specifically in alternative proteins. Mark my words, this is an industry that is going to boom. The products are amazing. They are getting better every day. And the only challenge is actually bringing it to scale. And so that's where investors need to come in, because I know companies that they have great partnership. They have great sales. They want to take a factory and grow it 15x, and they need not that much money to do it, but it's a challenging investment climate. And there's investors, don't see, they seem to be having a hard time taking a leap of faith here. And I don't even know why it's a leap of faith, but they view it that way. And I think it's because of, skepticism maybe about people's willingness to change their food habits. I do think that's realistic, but I think the challenge that the plant-based industry needs to tackle is ultimately it shouldn't be about persuading people to change, but rather tempting them to do so through excellent products and affordability.
Yes, and I do think once you make things affordable, the rest of the arguments against it kind of go out the window. People just like cheap food, and they tend to go for cheap food, and the rest becomes second nature. I also want to say that, 30 years ago, sushi was considered slimy, risky, odd. I don't know one woman who's not having sushi 3 times a week to keep her weight down or something like this. So, you think how quickly things can be adopted.
Right.
And so I don't think it's really that much of a stretch. I also think consumers like choice. I can see where the consumer's plate is not a black and white scenario. So sometimes you have cheap meat. Let's face it, folks, that comes from an animal factory with lots of drugs and the rest of it. The rest of it. Grass-fed, cultivated meat, and plant-based meat, and just a straight old salad or some lentils or something. I do see where you could have a much more rich and diverse plate, and it's not all or nothing. So I think those things can come around quite easily. I feel it's a little bit, again, when it happens, it's going to happen really quickly, a little bit of a lemming situation. Fossil fuels has just gotten so much play about clean energy being the solution. A lot of people still don't know. So I think it's a bit of an education. And once they do know, it's going to take less money to get there faster to that 10%. I threw up a slide not too long ago showing kind of an S-curve potential If you can get to 10%, which is in and around here, then the rest kind of becomes an inevitability. This research coming from Synthesis Capital based on the Rethink X think tank research. So, you know, a, a little bit of movement can go a long way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you're working on 10% targets. Tell us again how you're doing that and how we can help, because VegTech Invest is there to be with you. So
yeah, well, I think
people do?
Certainly, in terms of to the extent that you or other investors that you work with hold stakes in some of the large supermarket companies, Ahold Delhaize is a big target, Tesco for us in Europe, certainly the Costco here, Walmart, others, urging them to do that is, one of the key steps. Also fast food companies like McDonald's and Burger King, some of which, they've made initial, I think all of these companies have made initial steps. It's not like they're not doing it. It's like how much they're bringing it to scale. And then also, even with the meat companies, advocacy from their investors to set targets is meaningful. A lot of them, like JBS especially, are facing significant pressure from advocates like us, exposing their deforestation, exposing their pollution, exposing their corruption. And if, investors are saying this is a solution that we will support and celebrate if you really adopt it at scale, I think that is persuasive and can make a difference. And then ultimately, I just want to say all of that adds up to a better policymaking environment. Because once you hit a critical mass, once you have the lobbying dollars behind you, and once you have a movement of people who really are benefiting from alternative protein, either through employment or just through they love eating it and don't want to go back to eating animals, then you have a greater political force that can really change the game. And renewable energy, to a great extent, has just experienced that in the United States with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, but really preceded by 20 years of movements at the state level passing renewable portfolio standards and other clean energy supported policies. So we need to get there. And I think we're, at the early stages still. It's important to remember that. But to me, that means this is a massive business opportunity.
Huge business opportunity. Shout out here to the Good Food Institute that does a lot of policy work. And shout out to the Biden administration, which recently put in its biomanufacturing and synthetic biology document that alternative proteins, fermented proteins, cultivated meat, plant-based foods, all options deserving of more R&D. We need a lot more R&D, really, to get people the great tasting foods that they want.
Yeah, and absolutely. No, I was sorry to interrupt. I was just saying, you said something earlier. What are the obstacles? I think Good Food Institute, we mentioned, they've done a great deal of work to articulate, yes, we need more demand. We need more investment. We also need to build a human capital of trained technicians, scientists, and others, and get the government investment in R&D to enable this industry to scale once that investment comes. And so I think that is you're absolutely right to identify that.
Yeah, and to me, it's so funny because there's so many sticks, if you will, litany of stats. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, 30% of the world's global methane emissions coming from animal factories. 41% of the world's tropical deforestation coming from animal factories. The top 3 reasons for the next pandemic are relating to eating meat, according to the United Nations, with the top 2 being related to the intensification of animal factories. 70% of our agricultural land gives us only 18% of our calories due to the inefficient calorie consumption of animals to actually convert to protein. So much against us here, increasing antibiotic resistance, increasing healthcare costs with lifestyle diseases driven by eating meat, diabetes, heart disease, colorectal cancer. And even they're not disputes, labor atrocities. It is often seen that underage kids, maybe illegal, maybe not, working in slaughterhouses and unclean conditions. And we also, it happened during COVID, when manual workers couldn't have bathroom breaks, etc. It's just so much against it, and then so much carrot to the stick of the solutions being more efficient, cheaper at scale, solving so many problems. I do think that quickly here we'll turn a corner. I would add to your short list of obstacles is maybe it is the economy too. So I just want to see, once the economy turns around, let's take this out for a spin and, we'll see where we go. Okay, so as we wrap up here, I used to do this show at the beginning and say, okay, what do you predict for the next 10 years? But things have changed that quickly. I'm going to change that. So what do you predict is going to happen for this particular sector in the next 3 years?
In the next 3 years, great question. Well, I do hope that we are successful in getting, let's say, 3 to 5 more major supermarket chains or fast food companies to commit to that 10% target at least by 2030, so that we can really send a signal to investors and meat companies that they need to do more of this at scale. So I think that's key. I also hope that we do see more private sector and public sector investment in nature conservation and restoration, which is a complementary approach to shifting to alternative proteins. That would make me happy. Those two things alone would make me happy. I think to get there, we do need this sort of issue of prominence of the meat industry's impact to get a higher profile, so that there's just that urgency to drive investment in what's clean. So we're trying to deliver that with this perfect storm approach of legal work, campaigns, engagement with investors, meetings with CEOs. There's a lot of other groups doing good work on the political side, on lobbying and policy. And so hopefully that creates the dynamic that is needed to really deliver what is ultimately the most important transformation for the planet possible.
And what are your thoughts about the meat industry coming hard and heavy with attacks on the sector?
Well, in a sense, I mean, I always say this because sometimes we get attacked often when we're on the cusp of success. So I think that it's a sign that this industry, they feel threatened by it. But it's weird because most of the meat industry companies are both investing in alternative protein and then also funding groups that attack it. So I do think there needs to be some critique of that when like Cargill and JBS are funding lobbies that criticize alternative protein at the same time they're trying to cloak themselves in the green mantle of alternative proteins. That's got to, I think there's potential to change that. But I do think ultimately it's actually a sign of success. It can also be a threat, and we need to make sure that we're talking about this in a way that's appealing to people, and ultimately not just talking about it, but actually offering people delicious, affordable protein.
Yeah, I sort of see that there are so many who agree, the consumer, a lot of businesses, governments, advocates, doctors, that I hope to drown out the big dollars being spent by the meat lobby, but it is not certain. Let me ask you, do you think JBS will end up going public?
So they are publicly traded in Brazil. I'm optimistic, and part of the reason is this legal reason that they have such extraordinary corruption. That's our really number one rationale that we're asking this SEC not to go ahead. But they've also lied about their climate goals in the sustainability linked bonds that they issued. So we've got multiple rationales for why we think the SEC should stop it. It just would be extraordinary to me for the SEC to give a green light for a listing in the United States of a company that was fined $256 million by the SEC and the Department of Justice in 2020. And that the way this is structured is to concentrate ownership among the family that owns JBS that was responsible for that. So it would be really wild for that to go ahead, but we'll see.
We shall see. Go Mighty Earth, go. Go Mighty Earth, go. Okay.
Thank you.
Some personal questions. What do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
That's a great question. What did I wish I knew? I think I wish that I think independent. So Mighty Earth, in the last few years, has become a fully independent nonprofit organization. That independence has really allowed us to chart a really exciting path to growth. And we had a lot of great partnerships with different organizations, but you're also subject to the vagaries of shifting management and leadership. And I think once we became fully independent, we just were able to achieve our full potential and blossom. And that's still going on. And so I think knowing how valuable independence is, I wish I had realized that earlier.
Interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard that. And I ask this question to everyone, so it's interesting. It's a note for other nonprofits to get to independence as quickly as you can. Okay, you're having a busy day. You're potentially getting JBS restricted from going on in the United States. You're running around things aren't going your way. What is a phrase that you tell yourself to get yourself back in the game?
Get myself okay. I'll give some credit to Senator Ed Markey, who I saw speak many years ago, and he talked about, he was in the minority at that time, and he said, my wife tells me you get up, you get out the door, and you go beat the Republicans. And so, we want to work with the Republicans sometimes, but you just got to kind of get up and know that that's normal, that there's ups and downs. You gotta get out there, do it. I also more recently, I've really post pandemic and a lot of trouble during that time, tried to be a little zen about things. I'm so invested in the work and the outcomes and the impact and the campaigns and the success of the organization. When trouble happens, I think you have to sometimes detach yourselves from it, and I've become way better at doing that. And so that's been really helpful for me.
Margaritas have been really helpful.
Yeah, and margaritas, or you should come over to our house for some cocktails. So
Okay,
I mix all kinds.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Oh my word. Well, I'll before I did this, believe it or not, I interviewed a lot of celebrities, and Woody Allen has a phrase basically that 90% of fixing anything is just showing up. So just getting up out of bed, getting dressed, and showing up to whatever appointment that is, it's 90% of the battle. Okay.
I have to share another great Woody Allen quote. Not always true, but let's say it's funny. Friends come and go, but enemies accumulate.
So Woody Allen
wisdom, but I've had some. Fortunately, I will say, if you ask me something else, there really are some lifelong friendships that people just keep coming back over and over again. So
that's because they love Mighty Earth and they love you.
I guess that's right. Yeah,
certainly understand it. Okay, my very last question for you. Same day, you're still running around like crazy, and maybe still isn't going your way, but whatever, it didn't allow you time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
It's interesting. I love fresh fruit. So if I can have a fresh mango, or we grow pears in our backyard, Asian pears that we grow from the backyard, that would be go-to. Yeah, especially in this season because we still have them.
That's awesome. Mangoes, I think of mangoes back to the margarita. Mangoes with tahini and lime and herbs.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's my way.
I like the way
go. Mighty Earth, I am sure you are now a fan as much as I am. Oh, how I love Mighty Earth. I love what they're doing. Please support Glenn. Go to the Mighty Earth and Glenn Hurowitz's LinkedIn page. Go to both, the personal and the non-for-profit. Go to, you can see it scrolling across the bottom of your screen, mightyearth.org for those of you on podcast, mightyearth.org. See how you can get involved. Everybody can get involved in shareholder engagement, backing their target of 10% alternative proteins by 2030, getting larger retailers on board, as well as food manufacturers to make sure that 10% of what they're producing is alternative proteins. It doesn't take that much to shift. Meat and dairy run on tiny margins, tiny business margins. Shifting 10% is going to do more than just take away 10% of their business. It's going to force them to shift their business model. So this is what we talk about. The dominoes can fall really quickly. So 10% target for 2030. It's critical. It's some of the same targets that Synthesis Capital, Rethink X, the Boston Consulting Group, Bloomberg Intelligence. We can get to a number like that by 2030, 2032. You're really looking at the tipping of the system. That means change in our lifetimes. That has to be very motivating for everybody on this show. So get to mightyearth.org. Support in any way you can. Glenn, don't go anywhere. Everybody else, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank you,
everybody.